Thank you for joining us for the INGSA Horizon Series. I am pleased to be joined by Professor Joanna Chataway, Head of Department of Science, Technology, Engineering and Public Policy in the Faculty of Engineering Sciences at University College London. Joanna is a leader in the field of science policy and, along with her collaborators at UCL, is pioneering new integrated approaches to researching and teaching science policy and science advice. Joanna has extensive experience in the areas of innovation and technology policy, health research and international development, and has held a range of senior positions and appointments across academia, policy research and consulting. She is particularly concerned in how best to direct science policy to address issues of inequality and sustainability concerns. Thank you so much for joining us, Joanna. So I thought we might start with just some general reflections on the science policy interface in a post-COVID landscape, since that's very much on everyone's minds nowadays. It's apparent that COVID brought to light some of the issues with how decision makers both draw on and mobilise evidence in times of crisis. So in general, what would you say is the role of context in influencing how evidence is created and taken up?
I think context is absolutely vital. You know, we can see in the context of COVID, numerous governments have tried somewhat similar policies. For example, test, track and trace has been tried in lots of different places, lots of different national and regional contexts, worked very, very differently. And some things have worked much better in some places than in others. So I think an attempt to kind of devise a universal mechanism to fit every different context with a test, track and trace system would be doomed from the start, wouldn't it? Because there are different kind of ways in which institutional infrastructure foster data gathering, foster our ability to use knowledge. The linkages between different bits of the system that produce knowledge and use knowledge are very different. The political contexts are different, the economic contexts are different. So I think really the effort to try and look at how policy mechanisms and policy initiatives, which are thought broadly to have promise and to offer something, how they work in different contexts is a really major effort. And that's something I'm really interested in, how the mechanisms, how the interventions work in different contexts and don't work in different contexts, what we can draw from our knowledge of both mechanism and context to work things like to make things work better. I'm hugely interested in, and I think is very it's a real challenge for us as a research community and as a policy research community.
I mean, as a follow-on to that, what in your mind are some of the more enduring challenges that remain in getting robust evidence into policy science advice?
It's a curious thing, isn't it, that we live in an era when we have such hugely enhanced capabilities and capacities to generate knowledge and to transfer knowledge, share different forms of data and information so readily. And yet the challenges, as you say, do remain. And I think there's no one thing that we can pull a lever and things will get better. I think there are sets of different things we have to work on. For example, I still think the culture in many universities and many higher education establishments, organizations, is focused around a notion of research excellence, which is quite narrow. So, focusing on the big breakthrough research with, bangs and whistles attached to it, rather than seeing that actually our ability to make sense of those big breakthroughs and the science we produce is as important as producing it in the first place. We have to be able to use it. We have to be able to bring it together, to make it coherent, to make it salient and relevant to policy. And that in itself is a different form of excellence and a different set of priorities which systems need to nurture. So I think that's one big thing. I think also cultures of policy making, that's the other end of it, that some policy systems are set up to absorb knowledge and evidence and data in a way that others aren't, and different sets of expectations around that, different sets of sort of institutional capabilities, capacities to do that, commitments to doing it. So I think on both ends we have to think hard about what it is that's needed, and also fund it. We have to commit funds to making that bit in the middle work properly, which I guess is, in some ways it's such a wonderful thing that the UKRI, the UK Research and Innovation, committed funds through the Economic Social Research Council to our International Public Policy Observatory, which is trying to do that in the context of mitigating social harms of COVID-19.
I mean, while we're on the topic, would you say that within the system there are any tensions or pressure points that must be balanced looking forward? So I'm thinking competing priorities or agendas for different actors.
Yeah, great question. I mean, I think there are lots, and they'll emerge all over the place in many different ways. I think how you establish what the priorities are is no mean feat. It's a difficult task, and particularly in the context of COVID-19, policy agendas change so fast and context change so fast, kind of keeping pace with the need and demand for research to address very fast changing policy landscapes. The need for evidence in those contexts is difficult. I think in part it's a matter of building relationships so that you can keep a conversation going throughout those, that continual change. Dialogue happens, relationships get built, and sort of navigating the need to do kind of rigorous research, which does take a bit of time. We're shortening the time horizons all the time, but still takes a bit of time, and reconciling that with those fast changing policy landscapes. That sort of iteration, that sort of dialogue is absolutely key to that, I think.
And I think it's true what you say with COVID's certainly been at the fore of it all and has really accentuated some of the practice there. And with the events of the last 18 months, the obvious issues have been apparent, but one might ask whether there's somewhat of a negativity bias at play, and whether we can perhaps look to positive exemplars of the process done right. Have you observed any positive shifts since the pandemic and institutional engagement, or with science or within the system itself, whether at the domestic or international level?
Look, I do think there have been some really positive shifts. So although there have been, many mistakes and failures, as you say, it's really important to recognize that there is now a widespread recognition of the importance of science in policy, and science policy itself is far higher up on the agenda in terms of what's getting talked about in policy circles and way beyond in the media. So it's given a new profile, I think, to the relationship between evidence research and policy, and that's a good thing. There are new initiatives, many new initiatives emerging in this space, discussions about science advice and the way that it's done, much more attention being paid to that. So there's a kind of momentum building, I think, which is a good thing.
You lead the UK-based International Public Policy Observatory, in which INGSA has actually been an active collaborator in. The goal, very broadly, which is to rapidly provide scientific advice and international policy experience also around COVID-19 to policymakers. And the IPPO itself has been quite an innovative response to the very unprecedented challenges COVID has brought about for policymakers. And it, interestingly, operates both proactively but also responsibly to transfer information, relevant information from a range of sources to decision makers. And so I thought we might start with your experience with the IPPO and developing its structure. Could you speak to that? And also, how is the IPPO distinctive, say, from other evidence provisioning organisations? Like what gaps does it set out to address in this space?
Yeah, so the IPPO is recent. We launched in December of last year, so December 2020. And its mission is to try and use evidence to mitigate against the social harms of COVID-19. When we started IPPO, we had a very clear idea of what we didn't want to do. We knew from the experience of lots of us who are involved in IPPO and from the experience of others, that simply being in kind of a supply push initiative, so you're pushing out evidence, no matter how high quality that evidence is, it's unlikely to land in such a way with policymakers as to enable them to make good use of it if you haven't engaged with them before. So that model which says academics and researchers frame the questions and do the research and then disseminate was one we sort of tried to turn on its head. And we said this is going to be a demand-led initiative, which it is. So our firm kind of commitment is to engaging policymakers in defining what it is that they need before we go off and do the research. So that's the kind of model we're pursuing. Having said that, over the last few months of getting IPPO up and running and really kicking in with activities, we have recognized that simply going to a group of policymakers in any one area and saying, COVID-19, we're a nightmare. What do you need? What can we do? Isn't particularly useful either. What is helpful is to kind of iterate between the supply and the demand. So policymakers say, well, we need, this is a real problem area for us. We could you help us by supplying some research for evidence? Us going and looking at how that particular issue is being dealt with in different contexts, with INGSA's help, looking at what's been tried in different places, looking at some of the evidence around policy initiatives and experiences, and then going back and suggesting ways in which the conversation might move forward, and having that iteration between what actually the existing evidence is telling us and what the important policy questions and agendas might be is really fundamental. So it's the iteration, I think, that's key, and the conversation that's key. And it's really important from A to Z to do that. So from the beginning to the end, when we've done our evidence gathering and our synthesis, to then be available to help policymakers, decision makers think about actually what the evidence means in their context, how it can be used, how it can't be used is really important too. So yeah, that's that's what we've been trying to do with IPPO. How does it differ from other initiatives? I think one difference is we're definitely committed to working in that iteration space. You know, that's a big one. We are very keen on rigor. So we are trying to do all that iteration, all that engagement at the same time as doing very high quality knowledge synthesis with some pretty rigorous methodological guidelines for doing that. So we're trying to marry those two things. It's not that others haven't tried that. It's not that others aren't doing it, but I think, yeah, that the IPPO experiment is a slightly distinctive way of trying to use systematic reviews, knowledge evidence, knowledge synthesis in the context of trying to meet immediate policy demands. I think it's still quite unusual.
On the matter of structure, how does IPPO work with the policy community to frame these questions and to synthesize evidence, and to what effect? Is it a back and forth dialogue? Could you perhaps speak to that?
Yeah. So perhaps I could give an example from early work. One of the areas that we were mandated actually by the ESRC to work in was education. Also a big, sorry, background noise. Also a big focus for us is on mental health. And in early discussions with policymakers, the issue of catch-up, educational catch-up, kids have lost lots of time in school. What does it look like? How is that going to be done? Became something that we developed with them as a focus, and an early round table with policymakers and researchers identified a really kind of pressing need to think about catch-up, not just as educational catch-up, not as academic catch-up, but social and well-being as well, because those kids didn't only miss out on their classes, they missed out on a whole social experience too. So we then went away and did some more kind of scoping exercises around evidence that existed. We had some experts in the field work with us to write policy briefs and thoughts on how policy could be shaped. And since then, we've maintained an interaction with the policy community to try and help think through what those agendas that are broader than academic catch-up might look like. So that's a kind of, depending on the area, it works slightly differently in each case. But that kind of model where we're working with the policy community to define the question, to define the issue, doing some research, and then, as I said, again, engaging to kind of help sense make and think about how the evidence can actually be used in concrete policy. That's the kind of process we're going through. It's fair to say is that we've had a commitment in IPPO not to be, to try our best, not to be only focused on Westminster and England, and not to assume that the stuff which comes out of Westminster, the policy conversations, the orientations, will necessarily be right for Wales, Scotland, and Northern Ireland. So we're set up, we've got partners in each of those devolved nations, and we are taking very seriously the idea that we're not going to kind of trickle down from Westminster to the other places, that the other nations have their own dynamics, their own contexts, and don't necessarily reflect England or Westminster's priorities. And I think that kind of conversation between the four nations, horizontally, not vertically trickling down or coming back up, the horizontal conversations, the ability for policymakers and researchers in different nations in the UK to think together about things, I think is working well, opening up kind of new conversations. That's what we're hearing, and I'm very pleased about that.
I mean, further to that, what are perhaps some of the challenges you've encountered most often in your involvement with the IPPO? And
so
how have they been handled?
Sorry?
And how have they been handled? I'm just thinking, even with the devolved nations, and I mean, operationally, has that been seamless to manage?
Not at all seamless to manage, and you know, lots of challenges. Of course, it's resource intensive to do this properly, and to really take on board that you're not looking for policy engagement with one set of institutions. You're looking at the need to engage with multiple different institutions in the four nations. We're also keen on doing stuff at city level, because different cities are different contexts also. So prioritizing is a challenge, and how to do that. We're still working with that. One thing I think that we've done is to understand that across many of the different areas we're working in, inequality is a fundamental challenge. So we recently structured a large event to talk about different dimensions of inequality, and how they, how in and of themselves that they're pressing, and what are the different policy options that we might we might put effort into creating evidence around, but also what are the links between them, and how do they inform each other. So we did a prioritization after that event that we held on inequalities, which I hope is going to lay the foundation for what we do over the coming months. And going into that with an awareness that there are particular challenges, but often challenges need to be seen as part of the broader whole, is going to be useful for us. I also I think I know from another project I'm involved in, from other research that we're doing, that although spending on research and science is much lower, of course, in low-income country contexts, low-income country contexts spend a higher proportion of the money that they do commit on SDG relevant research, for example, Sustainable Development Goals. And I think the idea in many low-income country contexts that you spend, that the research that you do should be relevant to immediate social, economic, and environmental issues and problems, is perhaps, perhaps in those contexts there's more of a buy-in to that, and there's more experience, in fact, in trying to develop research agendas which do that. So I think that's kind of interesting, and that IPPO and the idea of kind of trying to synthesize knowledge for immediate use perhaps it will be well received in those contexts, and more immediately sort of welcomed than in high income country contexts. Yeah, there's some interesting work too by a woman called Erica Kramer-Mbuller, based in South Africa, and other colleagues on research excellence. And what she has found in the work she's done is that there is a broader in sub-Saharan Africa, there's a broader definition of research excellence than in many high-income country contexts. It's a definition which incorporates use of knowledge, not only generation of knowledge, but also capacity building.
What can an organisation like IPPO learn from the Global South?
The story of the pandemic isn't one where high-income countries have led the way and shown the path forward. In many different ways, lower middle-income countries have been ahead of the game and actually, showing the way forward for high-income countries. So we can see that, countries that were hit by previous pandemics that knew that the coronavirus, knew more about coronavirus than high-income countries had a kind of infrastructure to begin to deal with it. Their response was so impressive. And, they, as we were talking earlier about test, track and trace, and those initiatives have some really good examples of where low middle income country contexts have managed to make use of that technology and that system in a way that high income countries have struggled with. Yeah, and I think just being able to deploy vaccination, infrastructure in creative ways has been another way. We have a lot to learn.
IPPO's largely been COVID focused, but it's also been recognised, I would say, as a particularly novel model for guiding a best practice approach to science policy. And how does IPPO's particular structure respond to the enduring challenges that we touched on earlier of getting robust evidence into policy? Does it cut across some of the bureaucratic or institutional impediments and so forth?
Yeah, no, I think I, as you say, we've been COVID-19 focused and that's kept us very busy. But I think the potential for the model is that it could be used in other areas where there's a need for kind of ongoing knowledge synthesis and tighter links between research and policy communities. Climate change is one area where there'll be a huge need to make the best use of knowledge that we have available to address particular issues in different contexts. I'm working on a project at the moment about how we can better use and think about science, technology, innovation for the SDGs. Different types of IPPO models could be used to make sure that we can inform different SDG related agendas as well. So I think, the infrastructure that's being set up could be used in different ways across different areas of policy and research.
That's very heartening to hear that there is scope for that to be some of the learnings from IPPO to be translated over into other areas or issues of relevance.
I really do think there's possibility for that. One important thing that comes out of your question, though, is how does what we're doing in IPPO affect the next generation of researchers, and the importance of kind of capacity building for working in this way, I think is just crucial, because it's not, we've got to train people to do high quality, interdisciplinary, transdisciplinary, policy relevant research. And that isn't mainstream at all in the way we educate. So, that's a big area, beginning to go beyond particular initiatives and getting this stuff kind of mainstreamed into curricula and education, higher education is pretty crucial. Kind of a problem-solving approach to higher education. I think that's one of the bigger lessons to take from it all.
It's a very necessary paradigm shift, even within the education space, and certainly with training, in order to ensure that there is scope there and there's the resources there to continue on with a model or system like IPPO in the future. Yeah.
I think that, and I think, that broader issue which we touched on earlier of redefining what research excellence is. Those are the big things, the big institutional things, which will allow experiments like IPPO, initiatives like IPPO to thrive in the longer term and multiply.
As a final reflection, or perhaps just to leave us with a forethought on what we've discussed so far, how do you see boundary work of this nature evolving in response to the needs of decision makers, but also in response to long-term global and national challenges? It's a big question.
Yeah, it is a big question. It's hard now, where we are now, not to think that there will be more of it, that the boundaries themselves are shifting, and the ways we're thinking about spanning those boundaries are, there's all sorts of experiments going on, isn't there, around science advice and all sorts of kind of, as Roger Pilkey calls them, shadow science advice organizations setting up. I think COVID-19 has shone such a bright light on the need for all of that. Of course, we need to go on doing stuff which are firmly within the boundaries, producing the wonderful science, the high quality disciplinary based stuff. But I really do. I think the need not to just produce, but to be able to use knowledge, evidence, data, innovations it's so clear at the moment. It's hard to imagine that what has happened, the kind of blossoming of that agenda in the last year or so in this terrible context. Will go on, and I hope be used, as we said before, in different areas.
Well, thank you so much for your insights, Joanna. We very much appreciate your time, and thank you to our audience for joining us. We hope you will join us next time too.
Thank you so much.